Midnight ritual. There are things you don't mess with. Not in Ireland, not anywhere, especially not in the woods around midnight. But Finn and his mates weren't the sharpest tools in the shed. That's what made them perfect for what happened. It started as a stupid dare, really. A few pints down at O'Malley's, and someone, probably that idiot Sean, brought up the old tales of Dunree Woods. How back in 1866 the townsfolk burned witches there, sacrificing them to some demon god whose name was lost to time. Apparently, those witches cursed the land with their dying breaths, swearing revenge on anyone who dared disturb their rest. You know, the usual bedtime story stuff that parents tell their kids to keep them out of trouble. But Finn, Sean, Ryan, and Mick were all about trouble. They laughed off the warnings from old men at the pub, the ones who stared into their pints with hollow eyes, muttering about the midnight ritual. It was all bollocks to them, just another ghost story to scare off the tourists. So naturally, they decided to go and see for themselves. Midnight, they said. They'd go at midnight because that's when the witches were burned, right? Something about the veil between worlds being thinnest at that hour. Finn didn't really care about the details. He just wanted to see if there was anything to those old stories. They drove out to Dunree Woods in Sean's beat-up car, the moon full and bright, illuminating their path through the winding country roads. The air was thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath. When they reached the edge of the woods, they stumbled out of the car, laughing, pushing each other like the idiots they were. "Come on, you bunch of wankers! Let's see some witches!" Sean yelled, grinning like the fool he was. He held up a torch and waved it around, the light casting long, flickering shadows across the trees. The woods were silent, almost unnaturally so. No wind rustling the leaves, no animals scurrying about, just silence. It was the kind of silence that presses on your chest, makes it hard to breathe. Finn felt it, but he ignored it. Didn't want to seem like a coward in front of the lads. They ventured deeper into the woods, their voices loud and obnoxious in the still night. Finn kept glancing around, feeling like the shadows were watching them, but every time he looked, there was nothing. Just trees and more trees. They reached a clearing, the supposed site of the burnings. The ground was barren, the trees around it twisted and blackened, like they had been scorched by something unnatural. It was colder here too, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and settles there. The air smelled wrong, like burnt hair and rotten meat. But still, the lads were too thick-headed to notice. "All right, let's get this ritual started, yeah?" Sean laughed, pulling out a lighter and a cigarette. He sparked the flame, and that's when everything changed. The wind picked up out of nowhere, howling through the trees like a chorus of the damned. The fire in Sean's hand flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Finn's heart pounded in his chest, and he could see the others tense up too. "Who's fucking around?" Mick muttered, looking over his shoulder. But there was no one there. Just them. But they weren't alone. Finn could feel it. Something was watching them. Something old, something angry. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. The shadows around them seemed to shift and twist, moving closer, tightening their circle. "Fuck this," Ryan whispered, but it was too late. The ritual had already begun. Dark figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely human, their faces twisted with rage and pain, the witches. Their eyes burned with hatred, their mouths opening in silent screams as they reached out with clawed hands. Sean was the first to go. One of the figures lunged at him, its fingers digging into his flesh, tearing him apart with a strength no human should have. He didn't even have time to scream. The others watched, frozen in horror, as Sean's body was ripped to shreds, his blood soaking into the cursed earth. "Run!" Finn yelled, but his voice was swallowed by the wind, by the screams of the damned. He turned to flee, but the shadows were everywhere, closing in on them, pulling them down into the cold, unforgiving ground. Mick was next. One of the witches latched onto him, dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the trees, but Finn knew no one would hear them, no one would come to save them. Ryan tried to fight, swinging his fists wildly, but it was useless. The witches were relentless, their vengeance unstoppable. They tore him apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a pool of blood and broken bones. Finn was the last one standing. He could feel the cold hands of the witches closing in on him, feel their breath on the back of his neck. He fell to his knees, knowing there was no escape, no salvation. The earth opened up beneath him, and he was dragged down into the darkness, into the hell they had unleashed. The woods were silent again, the wind dying down, the clearing empty. The witches had had their revenge, and the midnight ritual was complete. No one ever found the bodies. No one ever knew what happened to those stupid boys who went looking for trouble in Dunree Woods. But the old men at O'Malley's? They knew, they always knew. Some stories aren't meant to be told, some rituals aren't meant to be performed, and some places should just be left the fuck alone. Emily's fingers gripped the steering wheel as she drove down the narrow, winding road cutting through the dense, unforgiving forest of rural Scotland. The moon was nothing more than a sliver in the sky, barely illuminating the world around her. The tall pines loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows long and twisted, stretching out onto the road like bony fingers reaching for something or someone. The radio crackled with static, and Emily reached over to turn it off, shuddering at the sudden silence that filled the car. She was miles from the nearest town, and the idea of being alone in the middle of nowhere had started to gnaw at her nerves. But she was almost there, almost at the cabin her friend had told her about, a supposed retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. A dark figure darted out onto the road ahead. Emily slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The car screeched to a halt, tires skidding on the gravel. She strained her eyes to see what it was, but the shadows seemed to swallow it whole. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she stared into the abyss before her, and then nothing, no movement, no sound. With trembling hands, she tried to restart the car, but the engine only groaned in protest. She tried again, nothing. The headlights flickered, and then, with a disheartening click, they went out completely, plunging her into darkness. "Shit," she muttered under her breath, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. She reached for her phone, but of course there was no signal. There never was when you really needed it. As she sat there, the darkness seemed to press in on her, thick and suffocating. Then she heard it, a faint rustling sound like leaves being disturbed. Emily froze, her ears straining to catch any other noises. A soft giggle floated through the night, high-pitched and unnatural. Her blood ran cold. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the tree line just beyond the road. There, amidst the trees, she could see them. Shadows flitting between the trunks, too quick to make out, but there. Watching. Waiting. No, she whispered to herself, trying to shake off the rising panic. It's just the wind, just my imagination. But the sound of laughter, a chorus of it now, mingling with whispers, grew louder, closer. She grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, its metal cold against her skin, and opened the car door with a creak that echoed through the night. Stepping out, the air was cold and sharp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. She pointed the flashlight toward the trees, the beam slicing through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. Just the endless rows of trees standing tall and still. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky, barely a whisper. But she didn't want an answer, not really. She took a step forward, then another, the gravel crunching under her boots. The whispers seemed to beckon her, drawing her into the forest. And despite every instinct screaming at her to stay by the car, she moved toward the tree line, her heart pounding in her chest. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie, dancing shadows as she ventured deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around her, the canopy above blocking out what little moonlight there was. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that made her skin prickle with unease. She stopped, realizing she was now surrounded by the forest, the road and her car lost somewhere behind her. She turned in a slow circle, the beam of her flashlight darting from tree to tree, searching for anything, anyone. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. A twig snapped behind her and she spun around, the flashlight illuminating a figure standing just at the edge of the beam's reach. It was the silhouette of a person, unmoving, watching her with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Stay away!" she shouted, taking a step back, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there like a statue carved out of the night itself. The light flickered again, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned wildly, the light now revealing several figures around her, all with the same glowing eyes, their faces obscured by shadow. She screamed and broke into a run, her feet slipping on the damp leaves as she crashed through the underbrush. The flashlight beam jerked wildly, casting monstrous shadows as she sprinted blindly through the trees. The whispers had returned, louder now, as if they were right beside her, inside her head. Suddenly the ground disappeared beneath her feet. She tumbled down a steep embankment, her body slamming into the earth, rocks tearing at her clothes and skin. The flashlight flew from her hand and shattered against a tree trunk, plunging her into complete darkness. Emily lay there gasping for breath, her body throbbing with pain. She could hear them moving closer, the whispers now a cacophony surrounding her. With a final, desperate burst of energy, she pushed herself to her feet, but it was too late. The figures were there, just beyond the edge of her vision, closing in. She tried to scream, but the sound was choked off as a cold hand wrapped around her throat, pulling her down into the darkness. The last thing Emily heard was the sound of laughter echoing through the trees as everything faded to black. Clara had always been a skeptic, the kind who rolled her eyes at ghost stories and dismissed urban legends as campfire nonsense. But there she was, driving her beat-up Jeep down a winding road toward the heart of Drevny Bor, a remote forest in Russia known for its dense woods and chilling lore. It wasn't the tales of missing hikers or the whispered warnings from locals that unnerved her. No, Clara was focused solely on her research. She was there to collect samples from ancient trees for her study on climate change, not to get caught up in silly superstitions. The air grew heavier as she approached the forest. The road narrowed, the trees thickened, and the sky, once a crisp blue, faded into a sullen gray. By the time she parked her Jeep at the edge of the woods, the light was already starting to wane. She grabbed her equipment, a flashlight and her notebook before heading into the trees, determined to set up camp before dusk fully settled in. Friday passed uneventfully. Clara collected her samples, made her notes, and settled into her tent with a sense of accomplishment. The forest was quiet, unnaturally so, but she attributed it to the remoteness of the area. As she drifted off to sleep, the wind picked up, howling through the trees in a way that sounded almost human. But Clara was too tired to care. Saturday morning, she woke up to a disturbing sight. The ground around her tent was disturbed, like something or someone had been pacing around her camp all night. Deep, uneven footprints, far too large to belong to any animal she knew, crisscrossed the area. A chill ran down her spine, but she brushed it off. Maybe a bear, she thought, or maybe some locals playing a prank. She couldn't let herself be rattled by something so ridiculous. But as the day wore on, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. She heard things, branches snapping, whispers carried on the wind, that made her heart race. Twice she caught glimpses of movement from the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. The forest felt alive in a way that was far from comforting. As dusk fell on Saturday, Clara's nerves were frayed. She sat by her campfire, clutching a hot cup of coffee, trying to push away the growing dread that gnawed at her. That's when she noticed the eyes. Glowing faintly in the darkness beyond the fire's light, dozens of eyes stared at her from the tree line. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. They were too high up to belong to any normal animal, and they didn't move, just watched, unblinking as if waiting for something. Then all at once they vanished, swallowed by the darkness as if they had never been there. The fire flickered, and the wind carried a low, guttural growl through the trees. Clara's blood ran cold. She was no longer alone in these woods. Something was out there, something malevolent. She retreated to her tent, zipping it up tight, as if that thin layer of fabric could protect her. The night was long, filled with the sounds of scratching against the tent walls, distant wails that seemed to echo through the woods, and that oppressive feeling of being watched. Sleep was impossible. Sunday dawned with an eerie stillness. The forest was dead silent, not even a bird call to break the quiet. Clara emerged from her tent, exhausted and on edge. She needed to get out of there, but her samples weren't complete. Against her better judgment, she ventured deeper into the woods, hoping to finish quickly and leave this place behind. But the deeper she went, the worse it got. The trees seemed to twist and warp, the air thick with an otherworldly presence. Shadows slithered across the ground, and Clara swore she heard voices, whispering her name, beckoning her deeper into the forest. Panic set in, and she turned to head back to camp, only to find the path behind her had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. She was lost. The sun dipped low, and the forest grew darker, more sinister. Clara stumbled through the woods, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They filled her head, a cacophony of malevolent voices that clawed at her sanity. She saw things, horrific twisted figures lurking in the shadows, shapes that defied explanation. They taunted her, closing in, driving her toward madness. Just as Clara thought she couldn't take it anymore, she burst into a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its bark blackened and scarred. Something about the tree drew her in, despite the overwhelming sense of dread it exuded. Carved into the bark was a symbol, a crude, unsettling mark that pulsed with a dark energy. She knew, without knowing how, that this was the source of the evil that plagued the woods. Desperate, she reached out and touched the symbol. The world around her exploded in a blinding flash of light. The whispers stopped, the shadows fled, and the oppressive presence lifted. Clara collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. When she came to, it was morning. The forest was still, but it was a natural stillness, devoid of the supernatural menace that had stalked her. She was back at her camp, the ancient tree nowhere in sight. Shaking, she packed up her things and left as quickly as she could, not daring to look back. Clara drove away from Drevny Bor, leaving the horrors of the deep woods behind. But the memory of that weekend clung to her like a shadow, a lingering darkness that she couldn't shake. She had survived, but she knew she hadn't escaped. Not entirely. There was a part of her deep down that knew the forest wasn't done with her yet. And as she crossed the border of the woods, she swore she heard a familiar voice whispering her name. Just one last time. The end for now.